Welcome to Blue Sky. My name is Richard Tannery, and I started this program to celebrate innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. Paul, thank you very much. I've been harping you for, 3 to 6 months now to come onto the podcast. So I really appreciate that you saw through. I'm not some kind of spammer, scammer, help you publish your own book kind of LinkedIn troll out there. This is actually an actual podcast, and it's just a side hobby of mine. I don't monetize or anything. I just like to give back to the entrepreneurial and innovator community and give a little voice to those I've noticed out there going above and beyond to help others and to create new visions and spaces for those around them. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. So how about let's start with a couple of little rapid fire icebreaker questions. Where were you born?
I was born in Rhode Island.
Oh, okay. What was your first vehicle?
My first vehicle was a 1966 Pontiac Bonneville.
Ooh, nice. What color?
The name of the color was Mission Beige. It was actually my grandfather's car. I wish I still had it, but it was too big there was nowhere to put it. It was a huge car.
It was one of the boats.
Yeah, it was a beautiful car. And my grandfather was a fanatical person. Very fastidious about everything, and the car was in fantastic condition, always garaged. And the guy that bought it, and this car was basically off-white color, black final top, black interior, but the guy that bought it took the whole car apart and painted it white, which I never understood why.
Wow.
Like, there really wasn't much to be gained by going from off-white to white. And
Yeah,
if you're a car guy like I am, you're kind of a purist. Like, whatever color it was born with, that's the color it should be.
Yeah. He redid the interior to white also?
No, he left the interior and the vinyl top. He just painted the entire car white.
Okay.
I never really understood that.
Interesting.
To each his own.
To each his own. Any hobbies or sports during high school?
Hobbies, activities, and sports. A whole mix of things.
Which one stands out? What was your favorite?
I really enjoyed, I played baseball as a kid, but then get into things like football and outdoor track. I was never a basketball player. I really enjoyed outdoor track, shot put, discus, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, if you're on death row, what is your last meal?
Boy, I'm gonna say it's gonna have to be a ribeye.
Yeah. Okay. And what's the local go-to food spot in Naples?
The local go-to food spot in Naples, I would say, there's all the touristy stuff, but I'm a big fan of Lake Park Diner, which is one of the Paul Fleming concepts, and they're expanding on that concept. They really have sort of taken the diner and the open air diner next level. The food is fantastic, very well priced, nice people, great service, all you can ask for. Sounds like a commercial, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a good plug. Maybe you can get a free lunch or something out of that one, huh?
There is no free lunch.
I love it. Great segue. What brought you to Qorval Partners?
Well, in the spirit of no free lunches, and that's more true than you would realize. Okay, I was working on a company on a growth plan and exit plan for a services company that was part of a group of family-owned business. I guess you would say a conglomerate or mini conglomerate, and we had done extremely well growing the business in a short period of time, and had run a process to find a buyer for the business. The business had gone from, I don't know, maybe 2 million to 40 million, something like that, in a short period of time. All those Inc. 500 plaques in the lobby and all that kind of stuff. And I had met a gentleman who was interested in investing or buying a majority part of the business when we ran the process to try to figure out an exit. And in that process, the transaction did not happen for a variety of reasons. Actually, just one reason, which I won't get into, but it was more or less at the deal table, the seller is kind of changing the terms of the deal, just sort of abruptly. Okay, we want this, and the gentleman that was in the process of investing in the business or acquiring I think it was a majority stake, as I recall. I've been in so many engagements and situations, they sort of mull together in my mind. But as I recall, he had put the pen down and stood up from the transaction table and politely exited. And on the way out the door, he looked at me and said, "Give me a call." I said, "Okay." So I gave him a call the following week, and he said, "Would you come down to Naples and meet with me? I have something that I think I can use your expertise on." Fast forward, I just took the shot. I went down and we had a great conversation. And at the time, he ran a small private equity group that had owned maybe 20 or 30 businesses and pieces of 20 or 30 businesses. And now, this is years later. So now he runs it as kind of a family office. I think they're down to one company. They have just about everything. I think they kept their last business. And he and I just sort of hit it off. We respected each other, which I think is a foundation. I always say people like to work with people that they know and like and trust, but most importantly, respect. And that foundation was there. So in the conversation, he said, "Look, I'm in the process of buying a business that is the largest rentals business of its kind. And we are we're trying to buy it. We're one of two bidders. And if it goes to the other guys, then there's nothing here for you. If it goes to us, then you are our CEO." I said, "Great, okay." That was kind of a compressed interview process. But he said, "Look, I saw what you did with the other company, and it's exactly what we need, et cetera, et cetera." I said, "I appreciate that." And it turned out they were not the winner of the business, so it didn't go their way. So the next step was, he said, "Look, I want you to go meet with this guy, Jim Malone. And I think you and Jim would hit it off. And what you do, or the kind of work that you've been doing, is very much what Jim had built his career on." So when he said Jim Malone, I was thinking John Malone. I think it was the Comcast family. And that was the connection in my brain. So I did some homework, and I looked up Jim Malone, and I realized that Jim had been a gentleman that had run 6 Fortune 500 CEO roles, 6 Fortune 500 companies in 6 industries, and had been a presidential advisor, I guess you might say, advisor to 2 presidential administrations, served on some public company boards. And I thought, wow, this guy's intimidating. So I said, okay, I'm going to take the shot. I reached out to Jim, and at the time he had this army of kind of admins protecting him. And somehow I navigated my way in. And back in the day, remember the admin was sort of the gatekeeper, right? And it was sort of this, this firewall that you had to, penetrate. So somehow I get in there, I get an appointment, I go and I meet with Jim, and he was very stern initially. And then we started kind of joking and warmed up, and we found out that we really sort of connected. And he said, okay, this is the way Jim would talk. "Okay, amigo, what can I do for you today?" So I said, "Jim, this is going to sound really strange for a guy my age, but I'd like you to be my mentor." And first he looked at me kind of like, this kid's got a couple of screws loose. And I was not a kid at the time.
How
And
old were you?
I was in my 40s. Jim said, okay. He said, I'll tell you what, I am going to mentor you. And here's the deal. You come and work for me, and I pay you nothing. And it's eat what you kill. But I will teach you, and I will connect you, and I will mentor you. But you're going to have to come here, be here, and basically work your tail off working on projects. And for all of that commitment, you do not get paid anything. That's the price you pay. Just like that. Now, anybody in their right mind would have turned around and walked out. And something clicked in my head. And I said, this is one of those moments where it's decision time. And this is either going to be the best or the worst decision I've ever made. And it turned out it was a great decision. And I said, okay, I'll do it. You have my commitment. And I shook his hand. And at that moment, my life changed because I think he saw part of him in me. I mean, I could never be what he was. I mean, those are huge shoes to fill. But I wanted to learn, and I've always wanted to learn. I still want to learn. I'm constantly reading, writing, creating, and it was an opportunity to be better, to be bigger, and to work smarter, and to have my eyes open to things about business and fixing businesses that I wouldn't have the opportunity to be exposed to otherwise. So for me, it was a no-brainer, and I took the opportunity. So we started working together, and I started getting deployed on some engagements in a mix of different things. Qorval had started principally in the mid '90s, and we still have a group of highly skilled, proven, tactical, no BS professionals. And I wanted to work among these people and be one of them. And then fast forward, Jim passed away in 2021, and I've kept Qorval going and did scale down the size of the administrative operation and all that stuff. We had a huge office, and we had lots of people. And that, in my opinion, it's really challenging to run an advisory business with a high level of fixed costs because it's such a variable business. So that becomes a bit of a challenge. But I did have the opportunity to work with Jim on a variety of engagements and situations across a mix of industries. And one that stands out in particular was I want to say in 2015, 16, we were working on a company that initially he was asked to be chairman of. It was a hedge fund owned roll up of 4 marine manufacturers. During the prior 5 or 10 years, the boat manufacturing industry, as you know, is very cyclical, had a very challenging time, difficult period, lots of issues and materials, costs, regulations, mostly a lack of demand. Very different than what happened to the marine industry, like during COVID, for example. So at one point, this roll-up was maybe a $300 million business. It had shrunken down to maybe 125, something like that. And Jim came in to be the chairman to figure out, how is this going to work? How are we going to transform this business? So I was doing some work remotely, and then I started to spend more time up in Indiana. And I was working with another team member, a great guy named Keith Northern, who had passed away a few years back. Keith and I were kind of figuring out, how does this business make money? How does this business lose money? Looking at rationalizing product line, bills of materials, build combinations. And the problem with the boat industry was it was kind of like the car industry was in the 60s, where you could have anything you want, right? Sure, we can make it that color. We can make the interior that color. But this company had a lot of inefficiencies because they were doing a lot of things internally they should have subcontracted out, things like building wiring harnesses and soft trim and that sort of thing. So anyway, fast forward, we run a plan to turn the business around, and then there was a CEO in there that had come from a big power equipment manufacturing business. Really nice guy, but he was not, as Jim used to say, a wartime consigliere. He was not turnaround work is not for everybody. There are people that are really good at growing businesses or growth plans. It doesn't make them a turnaround CEO. Turnarounds require a lot of complex, in-depth analysis, a lot of difficult choices and decisions. This guy just didn't have the stomach for it, candidly. So the fund had said to Jim, would you be the CEO and the chairman? And he said, okay, fine. So I started to immerse a little bit more in that process. And then one of the assignments was build a model that shows us what to make and what not to make. And I think I spent maybe a week. I think I was up for, 3 days, 4 days, something like that, working on this huge
in terms
spreadsheet.
of their manufacturing space, like what
Yeah,
to make,
like what are the
physically?
build
Yeah.
combinations? How do we,
Okay.
what is this gigantic regression model that figures out, all the possible things that we could build and which actions we take? An action would be like, don't offer this option, stop manufacturing this price has to go up by X%. And we started to see where they were losing money. So that model was instrumental in getting a buyer to have the confidence to look at the business and say, okay, it's fixable. Jim had a touch of clairvoyance about him. And I remember him saying, I have a feeling that the buyer of this business is going to be a company that's in this general area. And it turned out it was a competitor that had been started by one of this own company's employees early on, and they figured out a way to build a better mousetrap. So they bought the business. And later on, it became part of Polaris. It was a very, very large acquisition later on. But those are the kinds of projects that we would get involved in and still do. I think my current tally is almost 90 engagements, almost 40 industries, give or take.
Wow.
And one of the things that happens, Richard, is you realize that you can't stereotype, you can't typecast, you can't. For example, if you're in a manufacturer of metal tubing, and 5 years ago you were in a manufacturer of metal tubing, you can't assume that they have the same issues, because they don't. Every situation is discrete and different. At different points in time, I wound up, for whatever reason, working on about 5 companies in the same industry, in the same area in the New York metro, that had all competed with each other at one point or another. And some of the people that were there at different times wound up in other companies. And it was just kind of crazy. But they all had different issues, even though they're all in the same industry. And again, you really have to do the analysis. You have to do the work. You have to do the math. You remember when we were in school, your teacher in algebra or geometry would say, you have to show your work, right? And literally it's that process. You have to show your work. You have to do the diligence. You have to do the work and let the data lead you to conclusions rather than, presuming or assuming. You can't. And sometimes you get some real nuggets and real revelations.
One of your recent posts really stuck with me. And this was the post about your breakfast with a gentleman, perhaps a potential client. And
yes,
you explained to him the difference between being interested, being dedicated, and being committed. Did you find with the one CEO candidate you mentioned a moment ago who didn't have the stomach for it, is that where that lesson came from, or does that lesson apply to a person or a potential client such as him?
I think it does apply to him. It's not where the lesson came from, but we see it time and again. One of the funny things is I've done lots of podcasts over the years, and a common question is, what made you decide to get into doing this kind of work? And it's kind of laughable because I don't think anybody in their right mind decides they're going to be a turnaround CEO or to work on transforming companies. And so let's look at a checklist on that. So this is why it's such a stellar and glamorous job. So, okay, number one, I get to walk into an uncertain environment where most of the employees look at me with fear and terror. Number two, I have a whole bunch of things that I don't know about yet. So I always say it's the things I don't know that keep me up at night. So there are, a whole bag of uncertainties. Number three is there's usually a multi-year legacy of gross mismanagement, in some cases, gross misconduct. Where are we? Number four, a lot of times the staff that you're inheriting is not so great, but you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes people surprise you and they just want to be led. I mean, I've had some great people work for me that were terrified day one, but they embraced the challenge, they rose to the challenge, and they became better through the process. And I always feel as if I'm doing my business, if I'm doing the best for the company in running my business, which is running their business, then I am leaving the place better than I found it. And I'm also leaving the people better than I found them. And let's face it, sometimes there are painful decisions where there are job cuts, but more often than not, if you approach the opportunity to transform a business from the standpoint of what can I do to improve it, save it, build a relationship with the customers, improve margins, get people motivated to do more, then it's usually a sustainable business. It's usually not that far from being transformed into a sustainable business. And candidly, a lot of the larger firms that bill a heck of a lot more than we do, they're not there to save it. They are there to bleed it. That's their model. That's absolutely their model is to hammer them with cost. Jim's approach was different from day one. Qorval's approach was different from day one. What can we do to fix this place? And I think I'm on number 6. The work is intense. We're talking about 20-hour-a-day work. And if it's a short-term engagement, say 90 days or 120 days, usually my opinion is not much can change in 90 days. But there have been cases where in a recent one that I was on where you have the opportunity to put the business on a whole different track after the owners have really kind of squandered the opportunity for 10 or 15 years to do anything with it. And in 90 days, they have a whole different direction, which is sustainable. Generally, what happens is it's just an enormous lift, but you start to get clarity as you're moving through the process. But one of the things that I do all the time, I call it turning over the rocks. I literally just drill into the organization and its people for information. I want to know where every dollar is going. I want to know what customers are saying. I want to know what employees are saying. I look at everything. I look at packaging. I look at, reviews online. I look at every little detail. Everything matters. We always drive a lean 5S, Six Sigma kind of culture, especially in manufacturing and distribution. I've run equipment rental companies where we have huge fleets of everything from, trucks, telecom fleets, cranes, trucking fleets. And again, you look at everything. Why is the cab of the truck a mess? Everything. Details matter because those are the signals that you're sending to the market. You're basically, when you run a shoddy operation, whether it's manufacturing or healthcare or construction, anything, aerospace, what you're telling your customers, you're telling the market is you don't care. And I recently worked on a medical device company, for example, and they have very poor quality. And my discussion with the management team was, this is a non-lethal product, but we're still in the same industry. So if we were making ventilators or artificial hearts or surgical equipment, how would you feel about this defect rate? Would you want your sibling or significant other or parent on the table using a product that has a, 35% failure rate? Like, is that acceptable? Who among you decided that that was good enough? So culture is critically important. Again, I'm back to the lessons learned from Jim. Jim had a great quote about culture, which I repeat all the time. Culture is determined by the worst behavior that the organization tolerates.
Yes.
And that is absolutely correct. In any given company that struggles, I always view, this is just my personal perspective on a business, but I think about a three-legged stool. I think one leg of the stool is finance, accounting, purchasing, procurement, supply chain. Another leg of the stool is operations, manufacturing, providing services, if it's a field service organization, the general operations. And the third leg is sales, marketing, communication, outreach, social media, CRM, branding. And those three legs have to work together. If any one of them is weak or absent, then that table doesn't stand. And there's a reliance, there's an interdependence. I did a turnaround on an automotive manufacturer a couple of years ago, automotive and off-road. And they brought in this young CEO. And candidly, I knew he was not the right guy. He was the successor, and the company has struggled since. But we were like two ships passing in the night, and I had said to him, I gave him that explanation about the three-legged stool, and I had developed 3 people into director roles in that organization that I had told the owners, regardless what happens here with staffing, you need to hang on to these 3 people because they are interdependent, interreliant. They are what holds the organization up. And of course, this new guy had fired one of them and let the other one walk out the door. And the organization was never the same, and it won't be the same. But despite having never been a CEO, he, of course, knew better. But the point is, again, I'm not there to have all the answers, but after working on so many companies in so many situations, it's inevitable that you have some level of depth of perspective so that you understand causally what works. Like we always, at Qorval, we always talk about the classical, the POC, plan, organize, motivate, and control. Those are the things that you have to do, not just for the work or for the operation, but you have to do that for the people, right? And management is not about dictating. Management is not about command and control. Management is about motivation. A few years back, I was asked to go into a large global pharmaceutical manufacturing business to fix this business that was way off track. 350 million revenue, bleeding cash, 8 or 9 totally disconnected operations, bucket loads of money on ERP systems that didn't work. Just lots of issues, lack of motivation. When you start to lay out a comprehensive plan and you communicate to employees and the other stakeholders, your customers, even your vendors, everybody forgets about the vendors. So I went all over the world and met with the employees, the customers, the vendors, the regulators. We had one manufacturing business in Europe that exports sterile product and is regulated by something like 71 global versions of the FDA. So when you start to make changes, and in this case, we had terminated the CEO, COO, and CFO on a Monday morning. And then I'm a guy with no pharma experience going in to figure out, what to make of this business and how to fix it. And everybody's looking at me like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's not from pharma, right? But I take that as a challenge. And a year later, that business started producing $32 million in EBITDA. And we restructured $150 million in debt. Very little of the improvement was on the back of headcount. It was mostly reorganizing the business units, renegotiating contracts. We actually gave a couple of sites back from the companies that they bought them from because we just looked at them and said, this company is never going to make money. This unit is going to bleed forever. I flew to London, met with AstraZeneca, and basically, negotiated an opportunity to hand them back the site. But it's those kinds of challenging decisions. But that company is still very, very vibrant, very profitable, has been for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But those people still have jobs because somebody was willing to come in and do the work to fix the business, right? And that's what's crazy about this kind of work. If you do it well, you put yourself out of work. But back to what I was saying earlier about management styles, you can't talk down to people. You can't browbeat people. It doesn't work. And again, back to this, young CEO coming in this company, this manufacturing company, he thought he was going to shrink to greatness and shrink to profitability by letting people walk out the door or cutting people, or really dumb moves like, okay, let's say we're exhibiting in 30 trade shows, and all of these trade shows build awareness of a struggling brand. Let's cut all the trade shows, and that way we'll save all that money, right? That never works.
No.
It's an amateur mistake. And sometimes that's a direction that comes from board members. Do you remember the original Batman movie from 1966?
Yeah.
Okay, you remember the scene where Batman and Robin are in the Batcopter and they're flying and they're going to look at this ship that's in the ocean, and then somehow the ship disappears. It's sort of like a mirage, and Batman is going down the bat ladder to sort of investigate this, and he's on the bottom of the ladder. This giant fake rubber looking great white shark comes out of the ocean and starts attacking him, and he's fighting and he's punching this shark. I always describe that scene as, that's kind of what happens when you're the turnaround guy going into a situation. You're Batman and you're trying to rescue this ship, and yet the board comes out and they're the sharks basically attacking you, and you have to have this fist fight with the shark before you can actually get to the boat and figure out what's going on. Sometimes that happens. Again, back to one of Jim's great sayings: nobody likes the light of failure shone upon them. Right? And sometimes what happens is this is a governance failure. It's very often a governance failure.
When you recognize that the cultural issues within the organization actually originate at the board level, and the board is that rubber shark trying to bite you off the bat ladder, how do you manage that?
In some cases, and I'm not a quitter, believe me, anybody that knows me will tell you that, but sometimes you have to walk away because you're doomed.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're just in their own way. And the problem, and again, I can't speak for every board because I've worked with some boards that are fantastic, but there are boards and board members that don't belong in those roles. They're there because maybe they were drinking buddies with the owner or something. But in any case, frequently you're really set up to fail. And this can happen too, even if you come in a different role and you're not the CEO and you're working for a CEO. That CEO doesn't want you to get too much credit, or that CEO is threatened by your presence or your experience. Sometimes they will derail some of what you're doing, and they will back channel and they will do whatever. Again, most of the time, if you're coming in as a turnaround expert, turnaround CEO, most people in the organization do not want you there. In some cases, you're brought in by the board. Then you have a different level of what I call the 2 A's, autonomy and authority. And that's important. You have to have autonomy and you have to have authority. Otherwise, your wings are clipped. It's very hard to make change. And then what will happen is sometimes there's an appeals court dynamic where you're pressuring somebody to do a better job in their role, and then they feel like they're getting picked on, so they back channel back to the board or the owner or somebody else. That never works. The most successful transformations and turnarounds are ones where they are ready for the truth, they accept the truth, they accept the consequences, they accept the responsibility and the liability, and they let you do what they hired you to do, which is save the business, fix the business, bring it back to profitability. But one thing that drives me insane is the undermining or the meddling or that sort of dynamic. You can't have that. If you're hired to do a job, you need to have the runway, again, the autonomy and authority to do what they hired you to do. So in some cases, it's best to either turn down the engagement or to bow out at some point.
Have you experienced some level of reciprocity in the lessons you've learned in dealing with clients as applied to what you've needed to do to maybe fix some stuff with Qorval? You mentioned earlier you needed to trim down some fixed costs just due to the cyclicity or the cyclical nature of this type of business. In the spirit of the gardener's garden goes untended, have you learned anything about how to apply these lessons to Qorval?
Absolutely. Again, we have to look inward through that same objective lens, what we call objective perspective, to say, okay, is there a better way I could be doing this? Are these costs necessary? How do we originate business? How do we conduct business? How do we service clients? And is there an opportunity to lead? What's interesting, I always draw parallels between hiring advisors and hiring consultants, very similar to the process of hiring, for example, an attorney or an investment banker or a different professional. And there are all different, like think of all the attorneys that like I know a million attorneys, and they're all over the map with their personalities and styles. And there are some that are very rigid, and it's like, okay, I'm not going to talk to you until you sign my engagement letter and then wire the retainer, then I'll talk to you. And then there are the ones that are like, hey, Paul's my friend, his client, Richard, needs some help. Happy to have a conversation to put Richard's mind at ease and give him some thoughts about how he might be able to approach this situation that is, bothering him or keeping him up at night. Again, it's a range, right? Culturally, I think Qorval has always been the latter. It's always been, let me have a conversation with somebody. Let me see if I can help them. And what I always say is, I'm happy to speak with you. If we can't help you, odds are we know someone that can. But tell me what's going on. Like, let me know what I can do. And I always try to create value and try to, be kind to people and compassionate to people, because that's my value system. That's how I was raised. That's important. Rather than sign the engagement letter and give me a retainer, then we can talk. Not our style. I mean, at some point we can't work for free. If we're going to work for you and engage, then that's the process. We do a proposal or an engagement, and then we talk about, what the mutual goals should be, what the timing, how long should this take, what's involved, who are the people that we need to deploy, what does an engagement look like so that we can do what you need us to do. But in some cases, somebody just needs a conversation, and I do that. I don't want to say it's any kind of a formal pro bono program or anything like that. It's not. I just genuinely, I love people. I love to help people. Everybody goes through things, right? Life is nonlinear. We all have peaks and valleys. And sometimes people just want to talk to somebody that maybe has a little bit more knowledge or information where, they can allay some fears and they can provide some guidance. I met a couple a few months back that were really going through some difficult times. They're in the process of winding it down. They were in the sort of the firearms accessories and ammunition business, and it kind of wasn't going the way they hoped. I spent a lot of time with them on the phone and kind of talked them through and learned about their business. They can't afford to pay me. And I told them right out, I'm like, look, I'll help you out. You can't afford me, but I like your industry. I know some people that know them, and those people are important to me as well. One gentleman in particular who's been a friend of Qorval for years, great guy, has worked with us on projects. So he knew them, and he's like, look, can you just take a look at this thing and see if you can help these guys out? Wound up connecting with them, and, we've had countless conversations on the phone. And I kind of just told them what they needed to do, put them on a path, and they are successfully winding the business down themselves and kind of being almost like their own turnaround shop. And they've learned in the process, how does this work? What's the terminology? What's the process? And what was interesting is they have a group of investors, and they were forthright with these investors. I said to them, look, the last thing you want to do is spend all the invested capital and then say, our plan didn't work. You need to stop the train right now and go to the investors and say, look, here's where we are. It's not going well. We want to return the balance of the capital. We're going to need to hold a little bit of it back so we can wind this thing down. But we've tried everything, and this business is just not going to work for a variety of headwinds. Not the least of which is, the intensity of regulation and everything else because of the industry they're in. But I think in retrospect, if nothing else, they learned something about themselves and each other. And that's a good thing. That's a good outcome.
The concept of winding it down, you're talking dissolving the company, closing the doors, so to speak?
Yes, a wind down is an orderly closure based on the size of the organization. That can have varying degrees of complexity. In some cases, it's literally, close the door, sell the inventory if you have inventory, or just stop doing work, stop taking work on, file your taxes, all that kind of stuff. In some cases, it's very involved, and it's things like closing plants, selling real estate, having an auction, dismantling equipment. It can be very involved. And I've been in some very complex wind downs where you have, in a lot of businesses, obviously, you have a creditor stack, right? You have a senior secured lender. And if, again, a lot of people don't know what that process looks like. Okay, do you have a commercial bank? Yes. Okay, do they have an all assets lien? I don't know. Well, did you sign something? I don't remember. Was there a UCC1 filing? What does that mean? Do you have a security statement filed on record with your state Secretary of State to perfect a security interest in the assets of your business? Not sure what that means. Okay, who's your bank? So sometimes it varies. I mean, there are situations where the borrowers are very savvy. They know exactly what's happening. And there are others where, there's what I call the sign and drive. And this is typical of contractors that maybe grew quickly, maybe didn't go to, not that it matters, maybe didn't go to college, maybe didn't have any formal business training, never worked in a corporate environment. They just have a good business building whatever. And, maybe they're working on cell towers or something like that. But they just kind of grew quickly, and they needed stuff. They needed a warehouse. They needed pickup trucks. They needed tools. They needed equipment. And they just went out and sign and drive. Right? Talk to their bank. I know a guy that knows a guy. They go to the Ford dealer. They go to the Chevy dealer. They go get a bunch of white trucks. And they don't really think about consequences down the road. Maybe they sign some personal guarantees. That's generally something to be avoided, but hard to do nowadays. I mean, you can't get an office copier machine anymore without a personal guarantee. So it's a little bit challenging. But again, nobody gets in business with the idea that there's a risk of failure. But it happens. It just happens for a variety of reasons. So lots of uncontrollables. I mean, look at what happened through COVID. There probably were some restaurants that were on the cusp of closing, and maybe COVID was the greatest thing that could have happened to them because they had a substantial aid package, and they picked up a couple of rounds of PPP that got their employees paid or whatever. COVID was COVID was a good example of planning for the unforeseen and how sometimes things just come out of nowhere. It was interesting in 2019. I was working on a manufacturing business in Europe, and we had a bunch of employees get sick. We had no idea what was causing it. We had to surrender a license to the FDA. We thought it was a mold issue in a plant. Some of the employees had COVID, but we didn't know it was COVID because COVID wasn't called COVID. So again, sometimes you just have incomplete information. It's the nature of life. It's the nature of business, is that the only constant is incomplete information.
Have you encountered businesses since COVID who have really wrapped themselves around that PPP loan axle or the idle loans? I know I've encountered one when we're looking at small business acquisitions. There's a woman trying to sell her 30-year-old business, but had taken an idle loan with very poor information and consult. And she realized once she dug into the books that she actually needed to declare bankruptcy. Curious if you've encountered any fallout from those.
I have not seen any personally, but I know they're out there. What's more interesting is the whole, sort of shady rollout of the ERC, employment retention credit stuff,
Mm-hmm.
where all these, the people that were previously selling extended warranties for cars or,
Yep.
roofing in the state of Florida, all of a sudden they're experts on tax policy. But I think a lot of people have been burned with that because of some predatory, so-called experts, and they got into ERC credit situations that were not legitimate or not supported.
Yeah, well, it's shady when you get these auto dialer telemarketers 5 times a day talking about your business in a very generic sense and how they can help with the ERC.
Exactly.
Have you noticed a different type of client post-COVID versus pre-COVID, or this presidential term versus last presidential term?
Great question, Richard. I would say that going into, or let's say, back up a second, during COVID and after COVID, there were a lot of blindfolded dart throwing exercises with respect to private equity and hedge funds making bad bets. There was a little bit of a feeding frenzy for deal flow and for good acquisitions during and after COVID. And it's this idea that, it's the buyer model where people buy in rising markets, or, some economists call it greater fool theory. People buy something on the premise that they can sell it for more. It's typically what drives a spike in real estate values. You saw that happening in parts of Florida when there's a migration pattern in, and, houses in Southeast or Southwest Florida that were $350K, are going for double or triple that. So there's that dynamic, and I think that happened with businesses. Businesses were also artificially shored up because of PPP, and remember, they were able to deduct those expenses, so they had their labor cost essentially subsidized, right? And if they have good accounting, then it's marked out in the financials, and the three levels of financials are reviewed, compiled, and audited. Their accountant should have disclosed, what the effect of any COVID-related aid was. But in the short term, it's an opportunity to kind of window dress the earnings a little bit. What we've seen is after COVID, a lot of those businesses have been struggling. For a variety of reasons. The assumptions changed. Let's say that you're running a service company and you have a fleet of vehicles using gasoline or diesel fuel. During, again, not to sound political, but during Trump's administration, gasoline was very cheap. Right now, gasoline is very expensive. Right now, I am in California, where gasoline is $5 or $6 a gallon. Diesel is, more than $7. So if you're running a fleet, your operating cost has gone through the roof. Your insurance has gone up significantly. Vehicle and fleet insurance, corporate insurance, commercial insurance, everything from, general liability, excess liability, employment practices, environmental and pollution. The list goes on and on. In addition, supply chain constraints, right? People had problems getting imported product from different parts of the world, so they loaded up on inventory. Inventory was moving at a takedown rate of demand when people had discretionary and disposable income levels that were higher. They were buying more wants and fewer needs. And that tide has turned as well. The automotive accessories industry is an interesting one where, for example, if you look at an off-road product, look at a Bronco or a Jeep, something like that. Generally, the buyer of that vehicle is going to spend some amount of money to customize within the first, say, 90 days. Maybe they'll put wheels and tires on there, maybe a winch, whatever, roll bar, accessories, lights. And they were more likely to do that when money was free-flowing. Look at the electronics industry. People were home. They were buying large screen TVs because they were home. They were buying computers because they were on Zoom. I just read an article yesterday about the valley, if you will, happening in demand for outdoor grilling. Mm-hmm. And the sale of grills shot up during and after COVID because people were home. They wanted to grill. The price of grills went up significantly. So companies like Weber, Traeger, those companies are starting to see a slip in demand. And also a lot of products had pull forward demand. Look at the boat industry, the RV industry. People that were buying them during COVID, they were sort of pulling that demand forward from a few years down the road. Maybe they thought, well, when I retire in 4 years, I'm going to buy an Airstream. Hey, guess what? I'm home now, so maybe I'll buy that Airstream. So there's a little bit of that factor. Politics is always the wild card, right? So we don't know what's going to happen in November. That's going to be interesting. But I think it's gotten difficult for businesses to protect margins because of all these inflationary and supply chain related problems, demand issues. Just generally, there are lots of wants that are offered in the market, not so many needs. I was talking with somebody that runs a advanced auto parts store recently and was complaining about the challenges of running an auto parts store. He said, well, what do you think about this? I said, well, okay, let's look at it objectively. For the average consumer, there's no differentiation between Advanced Auto Parts, O'Reilly Auto Parts, AutoZone, the stuff you can get at Walmart, the stuff you can get at Tractor Supply, some things you can get at Ace Hardware, maybe a few things you might be able to get in the very limited automotive aisle at Home Depot, Lowe's, even in supermarket in some cases. So there are some things that you can get in many different places. And then there's Amazon. So if I want Meguiar's detail spray, I don't have to go to Advanced Auto Parts. If I want Mobil 1 oil, most people don't change their own oil anymore. But if I want oil, if I want coolant, if I want windshield washer fluid, wiper blades, whatever, there are a lot of places I can get those items now. Again, when the average consumer walks in an Advanced Auto Parts store, how is that experience differentiated? It's really not. Most people that walk in Advanced Auto Parts or AutoZone think that they're the same store, right? Just as an example. So again, that's just one little tiny vertical. But the point is, Amazon has really pivoted the model in terms of understanding where product comes from and how I can buy it and what the price should be. We did a short project, I want to say it was 2 years ago, with somebody from Barbara Corcoran's group, and we had consulted them literally for a day. One of the largest and most successful investments that they had made is a product called the well, I can't say what the product is, but it's a wearable product, and it is one of her most successful Shark Tank investments. We've worked on several Shark Tank companies after the fact.
Okay.
And we could talk about that for a whole day. But this particular company was struggling because they made an interesting mistake. They're selling on Amazon, and they did not understand the difference between Seller Central and Vendor Central. So the stipulation is, are you selling through Amazon or are you selling to Amazon? Big difference. And in retail, you have something called MAP price, minimum advertised price. So if you are selling to Amazon and Amazon thinks based on their algorithm that your flow rate and your sell rate should be higher than it is, then they're going to do basic economics 101 and lower price to drive unit demand. So if your $69 product, they decide should be selling at $47.21, then it's going to move product. But in the process, it's going to really irritate the guys at Costco and the guys at Target and the guys at Walmart, all those other stores that have it on the shelf for $69.99. So that was their challenge. And they had sold, I want to say they sold $30 million of product on Amazon and lost money.
Wow.
Because the margin erosion really killed them. And it's not free to sell on Amazon. And then, when you're losing, $10 or $12, actually it was more than that. They were losing like $20 a unit on retail. So that was a problem.
So were they mistaken on how they engaged Amazon, giving them the wrong map? Does Amazon have some sort of authority to change their lowest price? How does that work?
They didn't understand how Amazon works, and they gave Amazon the keys to the pricing. That was the mistake they made.
Ouch.
So we sent them back to Amazon with some different marching orders and instruction. And you needed to do price protection. The problem now is, I think you're starting to see it already. I mean, just walk through a factory outlet complex where you go into pick them, North Face, Nike, Under Armour, Polo, Asics, whatever, Puma. Every one of those places you walk in, they want your email. You're going to get 30% off, 40% off, 50% off. It's become a race to the bottom. And all that product is now commoditized. So they went from a time, during the COVID supply chain crunch where you couldn't buy anything. And now all of a sudden the market's bloated with inventory. Same thing happened in the automotive industry. That's an interesting case study. Most of the brands, in my opinion, I think there are too many marks, meaning models, brands, and too many models. There are just too many choices. If you want to buy a mid-sized SUV, too many choices. And during COVID, as you recall, used car prices skyrocketed. And a lot of that was a cornerstone of businesses like Carvana, where, you buy a used car in a vending machine and they ship it to your house. Usually during that time was an inflated price, couldn't get vehicles, hard to get vehicles serviced, all that kind of stuff. So the market was artificially buoyant, and now that's all changed. One of the major drivers there is availability of consumer financing or leasing options. Because the interest rates skyrocketed, the lease money factors also skyrocketed, and the lion's share of new vehicle sales were leased vehicles. And people can no longer lease those vehicles. So somebody goes in to get whatever, Honda, Toyota, for $300, $400, or $500 a month, and now they have to buy the thing, and it costs them $700, $800, $900 a month, or they can't get approved, or whatever the situation is. That affects demand, and then the cars start piling up on lots, which is exactly what's happening. I took a ride by the Tesla factory in just a general area where the factory is in Fremont, California, and they have cars piled up everywhere. They're renting space to park them in lots. And I think there are other factors. Teslas sell very well in California because of the fuel prices, but There are a lot of places where they're challenging to sell. Personally, I think that the design has a lot to do with it. They don't really look that much different than they did 12 years ago. And people love them or hate them. But in any case, they're starting to pile up. Pricing's changing, deal terms are changing, financing, leasing, etc. Again, people forget that these are economic cycles that we work through. A major driver of turnaround and restructuring is the covenant violation. So for commercial borrowers that maybe were flush with cash or refinanced, or their business looked different during and post-COVID than it does now, they may be at risk for covenant violations. Banks were very patient. I think a lot of banks learned a lesson back in 8, 9, 10, 11, where they had folded the tent, or maybe they should have stayed in or let the borrower go interest only, or just keep them alive rather than liquidating. And some things have changed with respect to lender liability since. But I think you're going to see a major spike in turnaround and restructuring activity and insolvencies and bankruptcies, I think, over the next 3 years.
For Qorval Partners, who is your ideal client and what is your call to action for them right now?
Our ideal client is one that lets us help them. The call to action is how can we help you? How can we create value for you? How can we let you get some sleep at night?
And how can they contact you?
Just the website, Qorval.com, Qorval.com. There are several ways to get in touch with us on there.
Paul Fioravanti, thank you so much for your time today. I know you were on the road and have a lot of work to do for your clients, but I do appreciate you taking this hour with me. If there's any way I can help you in the future, please let me know. Please reach out. And until then, we'll talk to you later.
Appreciate that, Richard, and thank you for your time today. I'm happy to join you on your podcast. Hopefully we're able to share some information that helps people out, because that's really what it's all about. We have to help each other and create value for each other. Likewise, if I can be of assistance for you or any of your clientele, don't hesitate to reach out.